everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the Samsung Galaxy A22 and see how this particular phone holds up in 2024. Now, the thing I would definitely tell you is that this phone isn't a terrible phone, but it was a 2021 flagship that Samsung made. So because of that, not a flagship, it was a mid-tier phone, totally joking. And because of that, this particular device may not necessarily be worth it to a vast majority of people, considering that Samsung has definitely made much better phones than this particular device. But I will tell you, throughout the whole entire generation of devices that Samsung has made for their cheap devices, I think they've done a really good job. And honestly, in some ways this phone is still kind of decent, but like I said, I would probably recommend going up and going for a device that is still supported with software, that still has a life ahead of it, and this one really isn't going to be giving you that for the most part. But let's go and talk about it throughout this video. If you want to pick up some phones that I would recommend buying this year though, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Samsung Galaxy A22, on the front of this particular phone, you were getting a 6.4-inch Super AMOLED display. And it actually isn't really that bad of a panel. It's actually very surprising that you're able to get this type of display on this type of phone. Because think about it, this thing is a Super AMOLED display, 6.4 inches, and it's a 90 Hz panel as well. That's actually pretty insane to have inside of a phone like this. Considering that this thing is essentially, a pretty basic panel when it kind of comes down to it, it's 720p, but the fact that it is a 90 Hz panel is actually pretty insane, and I really, really appreciate that for Samsung kind of throwing that type of panel inside of this device. Again, that's just kind of what Samsung, I guess, wanted to do at the time. The other phones after this had high refresh rates as well, but that's still really nice. Considering in a way the iPhone 15, the base model, still is at 60 Hz, I really like this thing having a 90 Hz panel. It is also an Infinity U display, so you have that little U type of bezel at the very top, which is very cool. Not really that big of a deal to me, but still very nice to have. And there's really not that big amount of bezel on this thing. It's fairly slim for the most part, which again is actually fairly cool on this particular device. So from the front, it's honestly not that bad. The sides of this phone are pretty much, this phone is completely built out of plastic, but it still has a pretty good heft to it. It doesn't really feel like a super cheap or it feels like a budget phone, but it's not super, terrible. You are getting a USB Type-C port at the bottom and a headphone jack. And you're also getting a microSD card slot inside of this phone as well, which is another really cool thing to have. Again, I love that their budget phones have these, microSD card slots. I think it's a very cool thing, and I'm very, very happy that you are getting that type of capability on this type of device. So this in and of itself for sure gets a thumbs up for me, and I definitely love that and appreciate that on this particular device. Now, on top of that, with this particular device, you were also maintaining other things on this particular phone too. So for one, you're still getting a plastic back on this type of device, which again is probably perfectly fine for a vast majority of people. You're getting this quadruple looking type of camera, which it probably isn't as much of a quadruple camera setup as you'd probably expect. And we'll talk about that throughout this video in a second. You're also getting not too many other crazy things going on. There's not really there's no wireless charging inside of this phone. There's no IP certification inside of this phone. Compared to a lot of devices that you have nowadays, this device is kind of fairly outdated in a lot of different ways from that standpoint. But again, I do like the fact that this thing basically had it had that standard type of display on it, like that 90 Hz panel. I think that's pretty cool on this type of device. But again, this was a budget phone. That's what Samsung was trying to go for with this device. It was not supposed to be this super expensive phone that Samsung was making. So I totally get it. I totally see where they were coming from. And that's just kind of how this device holds up as of this point from the exterior. Now, in terms of the camera side of things, this type of device as well as it's kind of interesting too. So you are getting a quadruple camera setup here, which again really doesn't make any sense for me at all. You're getting a 48 megapixel wide angle lens, 8 megapixel ultra wide camera, 2 megapixel macro lens, and then a 2 megapixel depth camera. And this is another big thing going on here. So with this type of phone, you're getting, I don't even know what to say. It's a 1080p sensor on the front and the back, and the looks can be deceiving, right? This camera, it really isn't that great of a camera. And like I said, that's kind of okay, but that's kind of what you're getting, when you're getting this type of phone. But that's kind of what you're getting when you're getting this type of phone. You're getting a fairly outdated type of, camera. And inside of almost every single application you could ever imagine, it's probably going to be a very lackluster type of experience. You're not really going to be getting crazy nice refresh rate. You're not going to be really getting crazy great resolutions you can film in. And especially inside of social media applications, it's not really going to be giving you that great of an experience either. So it is somewhat going to be a lackluster type of experience that you're going to be getting on this type of device. And as always, I would hate for you to go and buy a device like this and for you to expect the camera to be amazing because it had a triple camera setup, you'd expect it to be great, or a quadruple camera setup and you expect it to be awesome. That is not the case here. It's going to be a very limited type of device and a very limited type of experience you're going to be getting. So keep that in mind. otherwise, I think for a lot of different reasons, it's still a very, very decent phone in terms of the camera for how cheap and old this phone is. But beyond that, I really wouldn't recommend buying this phone, especially from a camera standpoint. I mean, that's just kind of like exactly how I feel about it. Beyond that though, from a software experience standpoint, this phone is kind of interesting because it is in the situation where you're kind of like not really getting like software support on this thing anymore. It stopped at Android 13, which really wasn't that terrible. I think Android 13 really wasn't that bad of a, version for this thing to end off. And it did end up getting like 2 versions of Android, which I think is actually pretty decent. When you're getting a device like this though, you have to understand that this is, as you probably would have expected, a pretty old type of device. So it's kind of based off some older parts. It's not going to be giving you like the greatest experience of all time. And as long as you kind of know that, you could probably expect that the camera quality of this thing and the software experience of this thing is also not really going to be the best. But I do think that's completely understandable. And with a phone like this, it could definitely be worse. I think that's the best way to kind of put it. This type of device could end up being worse. And I think that's just one way to put it, but it's still One UI. You're still getting lots of features built in. Although it's not getting any more software updates, you still maybe have like some sort of a future ahead of this thing in some ways. So that might be one thing to keep in mind there. But beyond that, that's like another reason why I probably wouldn't recommend buying this phone, is because there's not really software updates coming for, ahead of it. So take it as you will, but that's like another very, very big, large thing that you have to kind of keep in mind when you're thinking about buying some of these older A series of devices. That's just kind of what happens. So keep that in mind. But in terms of that kind of covers it up there. In terms of the performance side, you are actually getting that MediaTek Helio G80 chipset with 4 or 6 gigabytes of RAM. And the thing I'll definitely tell you about this, performance I would say about this phone is that it's really not as bad as you probably would have expected. Like, it actually isn't that terrible. And I think that's kind of interesting. When you are getting a Galaxy A20, that phone really wasn't that great, but this A22 isn't that terrible. It's still, now I want to preface that by saying it is not a good performing phone in today's standards. If I were to compare this thing against the Galaxy S21, clearly the S21 is going to be better. And this phone is pretty outdated. I mean, it has half the amount of RAM as the Galaxy S21. So this phone is not a good performing phone in today's standards, but for how old this phone is and how cheap this phone is, it's actually kind of surprising. And that 90 Hz refresh rate actually does kind of add a little bit nicer of a feeling to it, which I think makes it seem and feel like it's performing at a better rate, which is actually very nice that I'm getting on this type of device. So I will also say the battery size in this thing is pretty massive, 5,000 milliamp hours. That's a very big size battery to have inside of this device. And I'll definitely tell you without a doubt, when I look at this type of device, I'm an interested fan in it. I don't think it's the best device of all time. And I do think there are definitely interesting things going on with this particular phone when it comes down to it. And I clearly would not recommend buying this phone anymore. But I do think in some ways, Samsung they do a really good job with their cheaper phones. And every time they make one of these types of phones, like the A25, A26, A27 in the future, I'm going to be interested to see what they do. Because I really do think that Samsung drops some really good devices sometimes. And I think they genuinely actually do a really, really good job with these phones when it actually comes down to it. So, in my opinion, I don't think the Samsung Galaxy A22 is worth buying anymore, but there definitely are a lot more phones that I'd recommend buying on top of this, which I will leave linked down in the description. You can get them from there, and you can help support the channel at the same time. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that helps me so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.